Testing 1, 2, testing.
Hey, buddy.
Hello, hello. How are you?
Good. How's it going?
Good, good, good. So I had a conversation um, that ended right at 1 o'clock, and then
Okay,
so I had to switch over because Lori was using another thing. So here we
cool.
are.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you for allowing me to do this.
Yeah, no, 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 no. I'm glad that we're able to connect and do this. So uh, let's just get right to it, right? So
Sure.
um, so Jared, I mean, just for our listeners, we've known each other through our connections with the Adler Graduate School that was down in Richfield. I think they've moved to, are they in Minnetonka now?
I know they moved, but I have not been to the new location,
Okay.
so I'm
Okay. So Jared, can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and what you do? Um, because it's pretty profound. I mean, I don't know anybody that produces the amount of work that you produce on a consistent basis. Like, I want to know how you sleep.
well, sleep's a big area I focus on actually. I do a lot of training in the world of sleep, so I can talk a good
Wow.
game,
Okay.
but in theory, I need to practice more of the things that I talk about, to be honest with you. So I'm a professor, a trainer, consultant, and researcher. I guess that's the best way to sum up the things I do. I'm a professor for Concordia University in St. Paul, and I run a online Master of Arts degree. I'm the program director for that in forensic behavioral health. It's a human service master's degree with an emphasis in forensic behavioral health. And we actually just launched a new emphasis area this week in trauma, resilience, and self-care strategies. So it's a Master of Arts in Human Services with an emphasis in trauma, resilience, and self-care strategies. And a lot of the work I've been doing lately has been focusing around the topic of trauma, adverse childhood experiences, developmental and complex trauma, PTSD, do a lot of training on sleep disturbances. I would say probably the main areas of research focus I spend time on in the past historically have really looked at topics related to the forensic aspects of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, autism spectrum disorder, and traumatic brain injury. So those are kind of the big areas. I dabble in topics related like confabulation, suggestibility, theory of mind, alexithymia, a lot of brain-based stuff. So we could talk
Fun
all day about
stuff.
those. Yeah, it's really fascinating. So
So let's talk. I want to talk. I want to talk about a couple of areas, right? So I think there's some overlapping, some Venn diagram overlaps, and around this notion uh, of trauma, and then I want to talk a little bit about like how has COVID, I know this might seem like a stretch, but like how has COVID like actually impacted or re-stimulated for folks some of these kinds of historic traumas, and how are we dealing with that? But so first let's start with trauma, right?
yeah,
So when people talk about trauma, one could say that this is just we are just being soft on people, that they just need to toughen up, right? But we've even heard from some of the highest offices in the United States that PTSD and trauma is just weak people, like they just need to John Wayne it up, although his real name was Marion, but that's a whole nother thing, right? So talk to us about like why should we be paying attention, or why now is this move to talk about trauma informed care, or even recognize that people are suffering, managing, dealing with, sometimes not dealing with
yeah.
this notion of trauma?
If you're a human being, you've experienced trauma at some point, some more than others, in my opinion. And if you're working in the helping professions, You're coming into contact with clients who've been impacted by trauma, most likely on a regular basis. So we really got to be aware of the topic of like secondary trauma or vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, empathy fatigue, burnout, all of these topics. They're big, big topics. Trauma can be from like a one-time event, from a car accident, being in a violent storm, something like that. But then you can have these kind of multiple repeated types of traumas that would more fall under the umbrella of complex or developmental trauma. So if like trauma happens to a young child early in development, like maybe it's child abuse and they've grown up in a home where they're exposed to trauma day in and day out for a long period of time, that's kind of pretty much complex trauma. And those experiences can impact that person throughout his or her lifespan.
Mhm.
So I'll give you an example. If a child is growing up in a home, they're really young, they're witnessing parents yelling, screaming, domestic violence, lots of just chaoticness in that household. That can impact brain development for that child. It can impact their immune system. It can impact their growth as they get older and get into school. It can have profound implications for how they learn. It can impact their memory, their attention. A lot of times they look like they have ADHD, when in fact, maybe it is more rooted in trauma, or maybe it's both. As the child gets older, it's very important for your audience to be aware, and I'm sure they've heard the adverse childhood experiences research. Very important to understand that research and how repeated exposures to trauma in childhood, and if that child doesn't receive proper supports and services, there's a higher likelihood that that child grows up into adulthood and deals with a host of mental health problems, behavioral, physical health challenges. There's really a dose-dependent relationship that's found between like the adverse childhood experiences and future adult outcomes. That's just a fancy way of saying the higher number of traumas that child experienced early on in life, greater likelihood he or she grows up, higher risk of asthma, higher risk of diabetes, higher risk of cancer, broken bone history, problems in marriages, more contact with the criminal justice system, higher levels of depression, substance misuse. Again, I don't want your audience to walk away and thinking if someone had childhood trauma, all those things are going to happen, but the likelihood goes up the more trauma someone has if they haven't had the right support services. So trauma, again, has significant implications throughout the whole lifespan. And why do we care about this, especially in the era of COVID? Because the research is very, very clear that COVID is really amplifying a lot of these things that were already here beforehand. So if someone had pre-existing health conditions, mental health, medical health, COVID oftentimes amplifies that. And if we look through a lens of like health disparities, unfortunately, people from certain ethnic backgrounds, cultural groups have been shown to have more trauma histories, unfortunately. Looking at historical trauma, racism, discrimination, even being aware of the topics of epigenetics and how trauma can be passed down through the genes in a way. And we can talk about that today too. But trauma can impact the next generation as well if the parents were exposed.
Yeah, but this I mean, quite frankly, this seems like, just like, I don't know. I remember when I got hurt, my dad would say, walk it off.
Mhm.
Right. I remember when, things would happen, they'd say, put some, I love my great grandfather. He used to say, put some Windex on it. Right. And, we were tougher then. We were, these seemed like, psychological pampering of people. Right. So I hear that. I get it. But
Yeah.
why should I really care about that? Like, why is this impacting me? I just looked up some of the ACEs, right? So let's go before we get to the behaviors. this child abuse stuff,
Yeah,
right?
you
So
bet.
neglect, all of these things, household dysfunctions, these sound like personal choices to me. Like if you made better choices, you wouldn't have these things to be in effect impacting your kids poorly, right? So tell me, why is it important for us to recognize some of these ACEs?
Because if we get in a deep neurological level, let's say the parents looking back at their childhood, did they sustain trauma? Did they sustain a head injury? Were they exposed to drugs and alcohol in utero? Was their birth mother, while pregnant, going through domestic violence? There's so many layers to this. And if they didn't have the right supports and services in place, they may be more impulsive. They may struggle with decision making. You bring up choice. There's actually a whole line of literature on choice making deficits, decision making problems, problem solving abilities, rage control issues. There's something called executive function that's really kind of the CEO of the brain. And the research is very clear. People with extensive trauma histories, executive dysfunction is very common. If you have a client who has executive dysfunction, what might happen? They could go from 0 to 60 in a few seconds. They may have a very difficult time understanding how their actions right now may negatively impact them tomorrow or the next day. How what they do right now could impact their child. It can impact the way in which they're flexible. People with these problems can be very rigid at times. And at the core of being resilient and being able to bounce back from certain things is being more flexible, being more adaptable. There's a lot of layers to this to take into account. And as the research grows and grows, the research is just absolutely clear. Extensive trauma in childhood can impact that person's brain development in the way in which they solve problems, how they parent, how they handle distress, how they interact with friends and coworkers, how they find a job, how they keep a job, how they cope with stress. Do they cope with stress by being able to name their emotions and get the help they need? Or do they see that as a sign of weakness and I'm going to handle it myself and I stuff my emotions? And now I'm dealing with acid reflux. I'm dealing with obesity because I'm stress eating. I don't sleep anymore and I'm just exhausted. I'm irritable all the time. I snap at people. I'm starting to alienate friends and family. And I just feel like the world's against me and all this stuff piles up. And now they're dealing with lots of rage control issues and substance misuse problems. It's a vicious cycle. And I don't think it's a sign of weakness to say, I need help. I can't do this alone. Actually, I see it as a sign of strength. Vulnerability, in my opinion, is a sign of strength. Naming your emotions is healthy. It's not a sign of weakness to say, I'm sad, I'm hurt, I'm angry, I need some help here. If we all did that, I think better outcomes could happen. And when we start repressing these emotions over a long period of time, they come out sideways. How do they come out? Anger, violence, aggression, substance misuse, overeating, taking it out on people that should not be in taking it out on. So we can go a lot deeper into all these topics if you'd like, but that's kind of my lens. And
Yeah.
you bring up a good point too, like that sucking it up behavior. You know, some people have that mentality. I'm not saying that's wrong or right, but if we look at the research, looking at emotional invalidation, like if you're growing up in a home and your parents never validate you and don't believe you and don't nurture you, I mean, the research, everything I read is quite clear that that's not a good thing.
You just I don't know if I'm drawing inappropriate conclusions or whatever, but as I'm listening to you talk, you just explained the social unrest in Minneapolis, right? Like the invalidation of people's voices, because people say, well, why would they do that to their own community, or why would they da 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 da? And and I don't want to get into all of that stuff, but the things you just kind of pointed out, like if there's not a good channel for these things and people are constantly being invalidated and there's no way to, and they've used the systems, it explodes, right?
Yeah.
And So no, thank you for helping me think about
Yeah.
that too. Like, there's a lot of that. And so how does, so first I want to talk about how does trauma get transferred from either one person to another or from one generation to another? Because you did say something about historic trauma,
Yeah.
which I like to, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So when we think of like historical trauma, collective trauma, those kind of things, let's say great grandma and grandpa had extensive trauma histories. How does that get passed on to the next generation? We really need to be aware of the topic of epigenetics. We need to understand how trauma in one person, if they're pregnant then and they're going through extensive trauma, how that can impact that child in utero. Extensive toxic stress exposure during pregnancy can lead to poor birth outcomes. It can damage parts of the brain that are responsible for our stress response system. That part of the brain is called the HPA axis, the hypothalamus, pituitary adrenal axis. If you have a client that has damage to that axis, it can contribute to a host of physical and emotional and behavioral challenges. It's a huge topic. There is some research to also show that extensive trauma in a parent can be passed down by placing like a biochemical marker to that next generation. It doesn't change their DNA per se, but it absolutely can be passed down and it can impact health and wellness and functioning. There's something called telomeres. I don't know if we want to get deep in the weeds with that, but it's a great term. If anyone wants to understand the impact of trauma on a really neurological level, I would add telomeres to your reading list, epigenetics to your reading list. Really be aware of that HPA axis. If you're working with clients with mental health or substance use or trauma histories, high likelihood that they have some problems with the HPA axis,
Hmm.
hypothalamus, pituitary adrenal axis. Each of those topics could be a podcast in and of themselves, but thousands of articles on all those topics. But again, what happens if it's trauma exposure and then birth mother is also maybe using drugs or alcohol while pregnant? Maybe she is in a homeless situation and she doesn't have adequate health care. Is she eating proper food? Does she have high levels of cortisol going through her bloodstream because she is fearful and in a domestic violence situation? I give some talks on like prenatal trauma. What happens if there was deficiencies in certain vitamins, minerals? Maybe the mother was homeless and living in a situation where she's having lead or mercury exposure, how that gets passed down to the next generation as well.
Hmm.
Lots of big topics, a lot of variables. Those are just some of the things to consider. So again, early intervention, prevention, support, understanding how COVID is amplifying these things, bringing up more health disparities among certain population groups, being able to reach people, not just face to face, but using technology too. And a lot of research showing that telehealth can be a great way to reach certain people, not just through the computer like this, but even by phone or text messaging, reaching clients, helping meet them where they're at, getting them access to healthcare, transportation, adequate food, all the things everyone should have to live a healthy, stable life. Easier said than done, obviously.
Yeah, obviously, right? So,
Right.
so when you talk about a couple of things, as I'm listening to you, that came to mind is a lot of stuff you talked about. Like, seems like this is for those people or for them, right? Whoever, however people want to dissect that, right? Are there, how does trauma manifest itself in kind of higher functioning and maybe even more affluent communities? How does trauma manifest itself in those places where I have enough food and getting resources isn't really a challenge for me? What does the manifestation of trauma look like in those spaces?
Well, if someone has proper support, good insurance, stability, parents who are nurturing, caring, obviously those are protective factors. If they have reliable transportation, access to good education, clothing, all the basics. Obviously, those are all protective factors. But if you work with humans, you like being around humans, people experience trauma. It can affect people differently, obviously, depending on several factors. But regardless, if you're someone that has a lot of money and resources, or you're someone who does not have a lot of money or resources, you probably will know someone or you've been impacted by trauma in some way. I've met clients who have been impacted by trauma who it seems like it has absolutely destroyed their life.
Mhm.
I've met other people who have had a similar type of trauma, and you would never even know that they've been impacted by trauma. There's so many variables to take into account. What is the client's education level like? What's their IQ score like? Do they have a good friend network? Or are they someone who has nobody and they're isolated? Are they around parents and caregivers, again, who are attuned, attentive, they're empathetic, they're understanding? Or do they have caregivers who are checked out, aloof, angry, mean, violent, volatile? Every genetics plays a role here. I mean, where you live plays a role, how old you are, gender considerations. Are you in a household where there's several family members? Are you in a household where there's just a few family members? So a lot of individual variables, environmental variables, social variables to take into account as well. So it's a difficult question to say, like, this is a yes or no, what we
Right.
would see.
Yeah. So no. I appreciate that. I appreciate that. And obviously, uh, there are buffers, right, that allow folks to. And I just look at my own family. Like my grandmother had 9 kids, and half of them would I would say have had traditional success, and the other half have had very non-traditional success. Um, but they grew up in the majority of them grew up in the same household, right? And so
Mhm.
there are lots of things that that were at play. However, those there are some commonalities between those who've had traditional success around buffers, like coaches
Yeah.
who took them under their wing, caring adults, connecting with communities outside of the family network, like church communities
Absolutely.
and those things. So I'm not a Jesus smuggler. I'm not trying to smuggle Jesus into this conversation. Just trying to say that being connected to communities, particularly if there is a lack of this positive network in your family, seems like it could be a really good buffer.
What's your level of emotional intelligence like?
Yeah.
Your level of grit, all these things, your level of resilience. What happens if someone had a pre-existing health condition and they're also dealing with some pre-existing traumas, and it's more than a one kind of trauma event? So again, lots of variables to take into account. But again, trauma can rob us of our joy in some cases. It can rob us of our creativity. It can rob us of our energy. So, I mean, it has significant implications. It doesn't matter what field of study you're in. You probably have friends, coworkers, family members, neighbors who've experienced trauma if we look at the research. So again, becoming trauma informed is not just a buzzword that should be out there for the mental health arena, the chemical health, the criminal justice system, especially now in the era of COVID, because COVID's a collective trauma. We're all going
Mhm.
through it.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if you're working in a grocery store or a bank or a prison system or a school. People are going through trauma right now, toxic stress, some more than others. So I think it would be a good thing to become trauma aware, sensitive, informed.
Now, okay, so I'm a practitioner. I have a patient in front of me. I have a client in front of me. How do I navigate um, helping them, aiding them, guiding them without re-stimulating, or I guess one of the buzzwords is triggering
Yeah.
their trauma. So how do I navigate that space?
No matter how much education one has, it's never going to be 100%. Just you being a male could be a trigger for someone. The lighting in your office could be a trigger. Someone talking too fast, someone talking too slow. Just being aware of triggers is very important. But I always say be kind, calm, patient, curious, understanding. It doesn't matter how much education you have. If you can form a positive, trusting, stable relationship
Okay.
with that client, that's first and foremost. Without that, it's hard to build a solid foundation on. If that foundation is cracked and wobbly, you're not going to be building a nice house. I'm using that as an analogy, but
Yeah.
create that stability, safety, and trust with that client. And that can come quite quickly for some clients, and for other clients, that could be years. I have a friend who's a social worker, and she's worked with some clients saying it really took years before that client trusted me.
Mm.
Why is that the case? Because everybody else prior to this person abandoned that person, didn't listen. I think it's important to do a lot more listening than talking, in my opinion, too. And just sitting back, listening to the stories, hearing their lived experience, giving good eye contact. But that could be a trigger in some cases too. Too much eye contact, not enough eye contact. So body language is important. But I don't think we can go wrong with being empathetic, validating, understanding. I know those are all big buzzwords, but
Yeah.
the research shows they work. Motivational interviewing is good, being culturally informed, gender sensitive. I mean, the list goes on.
Yeah, it sounds like, at the end of the day, for practitioners and caregivers, it really is just being thoughtful about your own behavior, right?
Yeah.
And trying to be uh, effective as
Mhm.
opposed to just following a procedure or just going through the motions, but really striving to be effective in your in the relationships you have with your patients and clients.
Yeah. And I think for us, we need to be patient too, because in our minds, we think, hey, maybe they need to be at this next level. Everybody's different. Everybody has different wiring, different experiences. We need to meet the client where they're at.
Mhm.
And here I'll throw you a curveball. What happens if you work with clients that are dealing with some neurodevelopmental or neurocognitive challenges, where maybe you have a client who on paper 30 years old chronologically, but maybe they have a brain of a 10 or 12-year-old? We need to modify our approaches. We need to modify the language we use, the vocabulary we use, the goal planning, the intervention, the treatment plan to match their emotional, cognitive, and developmental age rather than what we think their chronological age should be. So there's a lot of layers to this and it gets really tricky. But I think if we can just show up and be predictable and consistent and understanding and create a safe environment for that client, that may be the first time anyone's ever done that for them, depending on the person. Maybe they've always been in chaos. So really looking at their life experience and story can help us have more empathy and compassion for that client too. Maybe a client comes off really edgy and just very standoffish. Don't take that personally. Maybe that's their wall, that shell. Maybe they're testing you. Just show up, listen, be nice, be kind, patient, curious, calm, all those things. It works. Again, not 100% of the time, but it does work most of the
Yeah,
time.
no, and I'm listening. So I'm listening in my head to like the naysayers, and it becomes very clear that the naysayers are going to say nay anyway. Like they're not going to. So for the rest of us, it really is about making a choice every day to to meet our patients where they are, and to try to make sure that the needs of those patients, those clients, come first. And and it does venture into this sphere that's, kind of, people get nervous about this notion of equity versus equality, right? So we give everybody the same kinds of things, but we, in some cases, we have to give it to people in ways that is most beneficial to them as individuals, you know.
Absolutely. And professionals need to take care of themselves. being aware of the professional burnout, because if we are not healthy, that will trickle down and negatively impact the clients you work with.
Mm.
So being able to take time off, having balance, eating healthy, exercising, maybe it's being around coworkers and being able to process things with, having a supervisor, consulting with them, just taking good care of ourselves will hopefully trickle down to the clients we work with as well, because we can't burn out. It does happen for a lot of people, and the research is showing in this era of COVID, obviously, depending on what field you're in, if you're in healthcare or some sort of helping profession coming into contact with clients, you're probably at greater risk right now of burnout or like empathy fatigue, compassion fatigue, or just post-traumatic stress like symptoms. Maybe it's not full-blown PTSD, but if you're noticing you're starting to be more irritable and agitated, you're not sleeping well, you're having more nightmares, be on the lookout for that.
You're
Maybe it's time
drinking
to
a
take,
little, yeah, you're drinking a little too much,
heck yeah.
just to get to bed, or you're irritable. So these are signs that we should be taking better care of ourselves if these things start to happen.
100% agree.
Cool. So what are some, so I'm starting to notice these things about myself, right? So
Okay. Yeah.
I'm getting irritable. I'm I'm tired of my patients, they frustrate me, and so the stress is starting to build. And what are some things that, or some resources that as a caregiver I should be tapping into, so that and I'm experiencing, and I may in fact be experiencing vicarious trauma or secondary trauma, given the work that I do. What kinds of what kind of resources should I be tapping into, or places I should be going to kind of let the pressure out of my crock pot, so to speak?
Create a healthy lifestyle living routine. Going to bed the same time every night, getting up the same time every day, staying hydrated through the day, drinking plenty of water, not skipping meals. One of the best things you can do for your mental health is keep your blood sugar levels regulated. So not eating really unhealthy food, supporting your digestive health. There's a huge connection between digestive health and emotional and behavioral health. Having a technology detox day. If you're on the screen, I know this is very difficult. Detox from the screen, get off that screen an hour or two before bed. Because if you're looking at your screen, you're checking your gadgets up until bedtime, there's so much research to show that's not good for health. Getting outside in nature is healthy. Maybe it's journaling, maybe it's therapeutic gardening, finding a hobby, exercising. Some people say, I can't exercise, I got joint pain, back pain. There's always something you can do. Maybe it's working like pool therapy, chair yoga, deep breathing. Some people love doodling. That's very helpful for some people. Eating healthy, keeping your inflammation down. We could have a whole discussion about chronic inflammation and the role that plays with trauma exposure and mental health problems. Keeping your inflammation down by keeping your stress managed. Being able to say no sometimes. Maybe you can't take on another client right now. Maybe you can't work the weekends. Having some balance, creating stability and structure. But at the core of this, if you're not sleeping well and you're not eating healthy, it is hard to get traction. So really looking at what you put into your body in terms of nutrition. If you're up half the night, looking at your carb intake, your caffeine intake. If you use cigarettes, please quit today. If you eat fast food, don't do that anymore. Obviously, easier said than done, but just really being mindful of what you put into your mind and in your body, you'll feel better. If you're looking at just anxiety-provoking information on your screen right before bed, guess what happens? Most of the time, you have a very difficult time slowing down and getting relaxed. So find what works for you, consult with your healthcare provider, take care of your dental health, spend time with positive people. Those are just a few things you could do.
So I want to say thank you so much for the free therapy session you just gave me. I will, the check will be in the mail. No, all that stuff is so helpful, because I think as caregivers, we forget to take care of ourselves.
Yes.
And in this COVID environment that we're in, and this trauma-informed care stuff, when it seems like it has to be something extra we do, I'm not excited about doing anything extra. But making that a part of your routine, I thought that was really interesting that you chose routine, because routines turn into habits, and habits we
Yes.
don't have to think about.
Do it with other people too. If you're doing it alone, it's harder to form these good habits. Do it with family, friends, neighbors. If you can't, do it via Zoom. Join some sort of workout class via Zoom. There's all kinds of wonderful short videos you can do on YouTube of all kinds of exercises. Even start out small. If you don't have the time, and I hear that a lot, you can always find time 10 minutes a day. Maybe it's 10 minutes this week. Next week, it's 11 minutes. The week after, it's 12 minutes. Before you know it, you're going to start feeling different and better. And you don't want to go back to the old way of feeling. So it's a good reinforcer. Really be mindful of, again, what you eat, what you put into your mind, who you associate with, and get plenty of downtime to rest and process and have some fun too. Can't all be about stress day in and day out.
That's right. That's right. So Jared, I want to say thank you so much for sitting down and talking with us. And I hope we can continue to have conversations like this.
Yeah.
You're just a wealth of knowledge. You're so encouraging. And when I grow up, I want to be like you.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you
All
for
right.
having me on. And yeah, if you ever have questions, your audience has questions, feel free to share my email. I'm glad to answer anything that we talked about today in greater detail.
Well, definitely. And I think they'll enjoy this as much as I have. So thank you so much. And we'll talk to you later, man.
Thank you, everyone.
All
Thank
right.
you so much.